Hey gamers, how's it going? It's Mike Cassie here with our next episode. If you joined me in our previous episode, hopefully you got to see me take the time to put together a project plan for the entire board game project. A roadmap to get us over the finish line and get board games into your hands. So great, we've got a plan. What do we do with it now? Well, the first step from my perspective is to kick off the project. And we do that with, you guessed it, kickoff meetings. But before I get into those kickoff meetings, I wanted to take some time to make certain that I was as well prepared as possible before I got into them. So whenever you're working on any kind of design project, one of the most important things is to basically do your research. The more you know about the project, its stakeholders, the people involved, your customers, the more likely you are to have success. And so before I decided to sit down and have these kickoff meetings with Paul and his team, I wanted to do as much research as I could and learn as much as I could about Weirdwood and its universe. In order to do that, I did a few things. Firstly, I played their hit iOS game a couple times so that I really understood how the game worked, how the characters worked, and got some insight into the world. They also have a book series, and I took the time to read the first book, which was available at the time, and started to read a draft of the second book. I also took any opportunity I had when Paul and I were talking about the project in general to ask him questions and understand his perspectives more about what they were looking to do with this particular project. The other thing I started to work on was a project plan for the entire project. I knew that one of the things Paul had hired me for was not just to design the game, but also to oversee basically the project management and run the entire process. Something I was used to doing in my previous career as a digital product designer. Having a project plan, a roadmap about where you're going to go and what you're going to do is really critical to having a smoother project and ultimately having a better outcome of what you're trying to create. Another thing I did once I'd started to learn about the Weirdwood universe, having played the game and read the book, was I started to take some time to think about ideas for the board game and generate some thoughts around that, and I would take the opportunity to sketch those out or jot those down in a sketchbook anytime they came to mind. So after I spent some time planning for those meetings, it was finally time to get together with Paul and his team, which included Russ, Luke, Colin, and Bobby. Once we were all together at a common location, it was time to start moving through the schedule that I'd laid out for these meetings. And it basically broke up into 4 major areas. The first session I'd laid out was planning and logistics. This was an opportunity to walk Paul and the team through the plan that I'd laid out for the entire project. This was a great opportunity for them to learn what we had to do to basically get a game finished and to talk about coordinating efforts, who might be responsible for what at different phases and points in time in the project. So the overall time frame I'd laid out for the team came to roughly 33 months. That was really from the day we started our initial kickoff meetings right to basically through when we had games in players' hands. It was the full cycle of the entire project. The second session that I'd planned for the kickoff meetings was something I called Exploring Weirdwood. And this was really an opportunity for me to learn even more about the Weirdwood universe.
We have got this classic sword and sorcery tavern in the middle.
So in doing my preliminary research, I had also come up with a lot of additional questions that I wanted to bring to the guys. Things that weren't clear to me or questions I had that weren't necessarily answered in the book or the app.
So the wardens are trying to protect the balance, whereas the order are trying to disrupt the balance, right? There's that general sense of what's black and white in this world.
So in this Exploring Weirdwood session, I started with some basic questions for the team. These were questions I jotted down about things I wanted to know more about the universe. And it was an opportunity for the team to basically talk to me about the universe and really flesh out my view of it, my understanding of it, and give me new perspective on certain things that I made some assumptions about.
Everything's book themed still, but you've got people in armor there, and goblins and trolls and minotaurs and stuff like that walking around in there.
So after the session of Exploring Weirdwood, I had a lot more information to go on, a much more complete picture of the universe and what was important to the guys and how they saw that particular universe. So then we moved on to basically the third session I'd planned, which is called Ideation. So ideation is a common thing done in a lot of design circles, and basically, not surprisingly, the idea of ideation is to come up or generate as many ideas as you can in a short amount of time. And it's important to note here that in doing ideation, no idea is too crazy, too off limits, too stupid or different. Everything has value, everything has merit, and you want to generate as much information and as many ideas as you can, because you never know what idea might be the spark that sets off a really awesome design path. There are lots of ways to plan ideation sessions. I approached mine by coming up with a series of thematic questions that I grouped into different areas. I took all those questions and basically wrote them down on post-it notes and basically put them up on a wall around the room we were in. And then all the guys participating in the session each got their own blank set of post-it notes and a pen. And what I proceeded to do was walk through each question one by one with the team.
What characters or roles are in the game? So you can choose either. You can talk to specific characters from the IP that you like, but you can also answer more generally.
I'd read the question out, and I'd give the guys a couple minutes to basically jot down as many ideas that they could think about and basically pop them up on the wall underneath that particular question. Once everyone was done, we would take a few minutes to talk about some of those ideas and give guys the opportunity to maybe talk in more detail about what their particular thought was. In terms of those group of thematic questions, basically laid out into 6 thematic groups that were kind of tied to generating ideas that were fundamental to generating board game designs. So let me walk you through those. The first set of questions were really basic starter questions about the board game. Why would people play this game? Who would play this game? Where might they play this game in terms of the game setting in the Weirdwood universe? So basic questions to try and orient us about some of the fundamentals about the game. The second set of questions were around game goals and motivations. How would players win the game? How might they lose the game? Why would players want to do things in the game? What was their motivation to proceed and progress through the game? That led to the third set of questions were around characters and roles. These were questions about what kind of roles we might see in the game. Are there specific archetypes that we might want to have? Or were there specific characters from the universe we wanted to see in the game? The next set of questions then were about player interaction. How would players interact with each other? How could they help each other? How could they hinder each other? What kind of actions might they take when they were working together or working against each other? The fifth set of questions were around narrative. I knew going into the project that narrative was likely to be a big potential part of the board game design. Wasabi Entertainment really ultimately are storytellers. They tell stories through their apps, through their books, and through other animation projects. So these questions involve things like what kind of stories might we want to tell? Who might tell them in the game? How might we tell them in the game? And then the last set of questions were about app integration. I'd had conversations with Paul leading into the project where we had discussed the idea of having an app component to the board game. Part of this discussion came from the idea that Wasabi have a lot of experience in designing and developing apps and games, and so that seemed like something we should certainly look at leveraging for this particular project. So I had questions for the group about that specifically, that if we had an app, what might it do in the game? What kind of things might it stand in for or replace in the game? What kind of things might it enhance in the game? So after we finished that session of answering all these questions, I basically took pictures of all those answers on the wall so that I could later summarize everything and document it for my own future reference. And then the last session I'd planned for the kickoff meetings involved actually learning and playing some board games. I mean, we were there to design one, we better play some. I had picked a bunch of games leading into this session for us to learn and play. And I had to make some assumptions about what would be good games to do that with. And those assumptions were based on some themes and mechanics that I thought might crop up in the world based on what I knew already about Weirdwood universe. And this was an opportunity for the guys to see some actual board games and play some. They weren't all hardcore board game players, so it was a great introduction to certain kind of mechanics and play styles for them, but it was also an opportunity for me to potentially learn some lessons about what was important to them and what kind of things resonated with them as a group. For example, Paul and I had some discussions about whether there might be a trader or a trader mechanic in the board game. This was because in the Weirdwood universe, there are some trader ideas that kind of come and go in certain aspects of the world. And so we thought, well, maybe this would be something we'd want to introduce into the board game. Knowing that in advance, one of the games I'd chosen for the guys to play was Shadows over Camelot, a game that has, I think, a pretty good trader mechanic. And it was a pretty easy game to learn and play in a relatively short amount of time. So I set the game up for the team, and I made certain that there was one trader card dealt out to the group, and I let them play the game.
Russ,
It'll cost you.
I accuse you of being the traitor!
So how does this work?
So at the end of the game, we took some time to discuss everyone's feelings about the process and how they felt about that specific game.
What does it say?
Loyal!
And what was really interesting, what came out of that was that the group felt that while the trader mechanic was interesting and kind of cool, they didn't feel it was really appropriate for the Weirdwood universe. They felt that it was a little bit too harsh, maybe a little bit too had an element of take that, or just something that wouldn't maybe resonate with some of the people who already loved Weirdwood. So there was an experience in terms of playing a game that really taught them something, and I learned something from it. So after these 4 sessions that we went through over a couple days, it then came to me to kind of come back to my studio here and take some time to document everything that had happened so that I had this all for reference for the future. So for moving forward on the project, those 2 days really helped me learn a lot of things about what I might look at for some game design directions and ideas. There were essentially a number of sort of big takeaways that came out of that project. The first had to do with some themes in the game. So in the Weirdwood universe, there's these two worlds, the Fae and the Real. The Fae world is like a magical world filled with fantastical creatures and all kinds of amazing creations that seem to come out of a dream. The real world is really like our real world, the things that we're used to seeing sort of day to day. And these two worlds exist at the same time in the Weirdwood universe, and they maintain a sort of balance. And it's important in the Weirdwood lore that they keep that sort of balance. There's the opportunity for things from the Fae to pop into the real world. It's also possible for people in the real world to sort of come up with things that come into existence in the Fae world. And in doing this, though, it's always important, again, to kind of have a balance there. So thematically, this was something that came up a lot in the game, this idea of these two worlds staying in balance and how they interact with each other. Another thing that came out of talking about theme was this idea of magic and adventure and exploration and even mystery and discovering things. That's a real constant thread through a lot of the Weirdwood apps and books, this idea that you're adventuring through things, discovering things, there's surprises, there's fantastical things. So that was a really important theme that came up as well. And the last thing that came up thematically was the idea of cooperation. There is a lot of cooperation in the world in terms of those characters working together to solve problems and overcome hurdles. So that was also an important takeaway. The next big takeaway was about app integration.
Ideally, it would be great if the mobile app was just like another layer we could add on.
At the end of the day, the final decision was really, if we think including an app will help us make a far better game than we could otherwise, let's look at doing it. But we didn't want to include an app just for the sake of having one, just for the sake of having something that seemed sort of different.
With D&D, like one person has to set up the campaign and arrange all of that. I feel like the app could take that place, and some board games have been doing that.
It really had to make a difference to the board game that we couldn't otherwise achieve through just pure physical means.
It's kind of a get away from your phone kind of situation. So I don't want to make the game contingent on having an app to be a major play component.
So essentially, there could be an app in the game, but maybe not. The other thing that came up was the inclusion of narrative in the game.
Well, yeah, it's like trying to fix the rift. So, like, I don't know if they know, like, the larger, stakes.
And not surprisingly, there was a lot of enthusiasm for trying to involve narrative in the game, trying to tell stories, trying to really include players in a way where they felt they were on an adventure, on an ever unfolding journey that they couldn't necessarily predict. So that's certainly something we're going to look at. We also looked at game settings from the Weirdwood universe, and we'll talk about these more in the future, but three big areas that came up was something called the Bookropolis. The Bookropolis is this incredible, magical, mysterious maze of locations, of these different worlds and these unique locations and characters. It's super cool. It's too hard to summarize right here. The second location that came up was something called the Manor. And the Manor is this magical, amazing place that is sort of like a central hub to everything that exists in the Weirdwood universe, a place where people and creatures can cross over from one place to another. And then the third location that came up was the city of Kingsport, a setting in the first book in Thieves of Weirdwood. And Kingsport is this really cool city with these interesting factions and characters that we thought also could be a place to set a board game in. The last thing that came up in terms of takeaways from our sessions was the kind of game modes we might want to play in. And what I mean by that is, do we want a game that might be a competitive game or cooperative game or semi-cooperative, or what kind of modes might players be able to engage in when they played the game? Not surprisingly, cooperative came up as a really strong choice, so we'll look at that. But there was also some interest in a semi-cooperative aspect, or potentially the option for players to play the game competitively, so we'll explore that as well in our game design. After these 2 days of kickoff meetings, what was the final takeaway for me, or what's the next step for me in this process? Well, the next step for me is to take all this information, everything I've learned, and spend some time trying to come up with some game ideas and game directions. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to get together again with the guys, and I'm going to pitch to them a series of game design idea directions. And in the next episode, I'm actually going to walk you through that process in terms of how I come up with those and what those look like, and you're going to get a chance to actually see what those pitches look like to the team. I think that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks so much for sitting down with me at the table, and I look forward to our next episode. And don't forget, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll do my absolute best to respond to them. I really appreciate your thoughts and your feedback. So see you next time, board gamers, and keep gaming.